Okay, so Exodus is among my very favorite books of the Bible. People sometimes ask me, what is you're a professor of Bible, what's your favorite book? And Exodus is usually the first one that comes to mind. It's not just a famous story, which obviously it is, multiple movie versions, depending on the generations. Sometimes I reference the Ten Commandments. Sometimes it's Prince of Egypt. A famous story, but also an incredibly diverse book. A book that contains obviously the story, but also laws and poetry and what feels when you're reading it like a million chapters of the description of how to build and the building of the tabernacle in the last third of the book. Over the 6 sessions we have together, we're going to talk about all of those. The story, of course, I think is relatively familiar, but the other parts maybe a little bit less so. Part of what I want to do in our time together is make the whole book, not just the story we know from the movies, but the whole book in all of its fullness, accessible and comprehensible and meaningful. And I hope along the way to maybe show you some stuff in it that isn't immediately obvious, or maybe stuff that they don't teach you in Sunday school. Certainly stuff they didn't teach me in Sunday school. We're going to be doing Exodus Yale style. So I'm going to talk for 40 to 45 minutes or so, and then I'll answer whatever questions happen to have arisen that I can get to. For this first session together, really just a basic overview of the book and a few broad observations. The first point I want to make is perhaps an obvious one. When we start reading Exodus, we're in the middle of a story. We start here. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. That is not a new beginning of something. That's a continuation. We need so much information to process and understand this relatively simple sentence. Who's Israel? Who's Jacob? Are you telling me that they're the same person? He has sons. How many sons does he have? Why were they coming to Egypt? Where were they coming from? Why should we care about them? All of that backstory, of course, is found in Genesis. But it's not just that Exodus continues the plot of Genesis. In the Hebrew of this verse, though I don't think you will find it in any major English translation, the first word of this verse isn't these. The first word is and these. And these are the names, etc. Right? That and in the Hebrew signals to us that we're in the middle of something. That's not how a brand new book will start. So where are we then in the broader story? Well, at the end of Genesis, Jacob and his descendants are all in Egypt. Jacob has died, and Joseph too, after having served Pharaoh and all of Egypt so well. Joseph has just made his brothers swear to bring his bones back when they leave Egypt. He's on his deathbed, and in fact does die at the end of Genesis. And that's the setup for that, the lead into where we are. The plot of Exodus from there, as we enter our book proper, is pretty well known. I'm gonna run it down briefly. A new Pharaoh arises who oppresses Israel. Moses is born and tossed into a basket. He grows up, kills an Egyptian, and runs away to Midian, where he gets married, and is called by God to free Israel. And then he returns. There's some plagues. The Israelites leave. They cross a body of water in miraculous fashion. They sing a song. Then they enter the wilderness, where they struggle a little bit with sustenance, but find themselves at a mountain where God shows up and gives them some laws and some building instructions, upon which the Israelites decide to make a golden calf, leading to some unpleasantness. But then it's all okay again, and they actually build the tabernacle that they were instructed to build. That is God's new house, and God takes up residence in it. There you go. Exodus in very brief. Now, not to jump ahead or anything, but the same situation we find at the beginning of Exodus, in terms of continuity with Genesis, we find at the beginning of the next book, Leviticus. Just as Exodus is the continuation both narratively and grammatically of Genesis, so too Leviticus is the continuation narratively and grammatically of Exodus. Leviticus begins, he called to Moses. Again, who's he? If you hadn't read anything before this, who's Moses? And again, we have a grammatical indication in Hebrew that we're mid-story, right? Actually, even maybe mid-sentence, since the subject of this opening of Leviticus isn't actually named. My point in talking about the Genesis to Exodus transition and the Exodus to Leviticus transition is that Exodus as a book doesn't, and in fact can't, stand alone. It's the middle of a thing. And so to begin our sessions on the book of Exodus, I'm going to suggest that there is no book of Exodus. It is an artificial distinction. What we're reading in Exodus isn't its own book. It's just the second volume of a larger work. That work is the Pentateuch, or the Torah, right? That's the actual literary work that we have before us. And the individual books, as we call them, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, those books are and always were entirely continuous with one another. They're separated into volumes with names only because the whole work, the whole Pentateuch, was too large to fit on a single scroll in antiquity. So, they divided it at reasonable spots, no doubt, and like thoughtfully, but they divided it only as a matter of necessity. Conceptually, from Genesis through Deuteronomy is a single work. So at no point will I be talking about sort of the message of the book of Exodus, as it were, or things like that. Everything we say with regard to Exodus has to be viewed through this sort of broader lens of it being really just the second fifth of the work that we call the Pentateuch. So that's what we're doing here. We're talking about what's going on here in this second volume of the Pentateuch, which is still pretty interesting. Okay, that was point one. Now, to the second major point, and probably the first, or at least the most common question that most biblical scholars get about the Exodus, which is, did any of this really happen? So, how will I put this gently? No. Okay, let me soften that a little. No. At least not as depicted in the Bible. First, it's a general point. The stories of Israel's early history that we find in the Pentateuch were written by authors living in Israel in roughly the first half of the first millennium BCE. They were not historians in our modern sense. They were recounting the stories of Israel's past, not producing the verifiable facts of it. They had no verifiable facts. These are oral traditions, largely, that have been given a written literary shape. So on a very basic level, we shouldn't even really expect the stories to be true in that sense, right? Asking for them to be historically accurate as if they are a modern day history writing it's a category error, right? It's a sort of a mistake of genre. Some stories, of course, have a basis in reality, right? They may reflect a truth, so to speak, but that's different from being true. So, for example, a plague of locusts in Egypt has a basis in reality, right? Locusts were a legitimate problem. They did, in fact, swarm, and they did consume crops in devastating fashion, etc. That's not the same as saying that what we read in the book of Exodus, that God brought a plague of locusts on Egypt, is true. Now, even as we ask about the historicity of Exodus, we should distinguish, as we ask that question, between verifiable and non-verifiable events. So, a conversation between God and an individual in the story is unverifiable. right? We couldn't find proof of such a thing, even if it actually did occur. A plague that wipes out all the firstborn in Egypt, that we might expect some proof of. Either archaeologically, right? Ooh, look at all those graves. Or, textually might be the kind of thing that Egyptian records would make note of, perhaps. God appeared on a mountain and gave laws, unverifiable. Pharaoh and the entire Egyptian army died in a single battle, I think potentially verifiable. 600,000 men, which is to say around 2 million people moving through the desert, ought to be verifiable. People leave traces of their presence in large numbers, right? Pottery and grave sites, bones, campsites, etc. So when we ask about the historicity of Exodus, we should know what it is we're even looking for. So to get back to the question, of the potentially verifiable events, are any of them verified? And again, to put it gently, no. There is, in fact, really not a shred of archaeological or other extra biblical evidence for the Exodus story. There's nothing in the desert. There's nothing in the Egyptian record. The story of Exodus is just that. It's a story. It's not history. Having said that, does this story have any basis in reality? Is it entirely made up out of thin air? Maybe not entirely. This is, after all, a pretty weird story to just make up out of nowhere. If you were inventing your people's past, would you start them off as enslaved in a foreign land? So a few bits of reality that might be behind the Exodus story. First, we know that there were Semitic slaves in Egypt. Here's a picture of some of them. They're identifiable, in this case, the Semitic slaves, by their distinctive hairdo, or so I'm told by Egyptologists. So we know that there were, in fact, slaves in Egypt who were of Semitic background. We also know that some slaves in Egypt ran away and did so in the direction of Canaan. How do I know that? Here's an Egyptian letter describing that very situation. Right? And this is a letter from somebody who is in pursuit after these slaves. Right? They come to the fortress and they're passing the palace, and the person sending the letter says, if you see them, let me know. Right? How many people did you send out after them, etc. So slaves did run away, but you'll note that this letter is talking about 2 slaves, not 2 million. So the notion, the very basic notion that some enslaved Semitic people fled to Canaan, probably true. That is, however, not the biblical story, of course, but it could be something like the kernel of the biblical story. We should ask ourselves, what in reality is required to have generated the biblical story? Well, it requires there to have been some people, it doesn't matter even how many, some people who made that journey, who brought their story with them, who understood themselves to have been miraculously saved, and who attributed that salvation to the deity Yahweh. Once you've got that situation, everything else can be embellishment from there. Now, what about Moses? Totally invented? Good-looking dude. Okay, Moses maybe invented, maybe, but maybe there's a kernel there too. Again, not because we have any extra biblical evidence for such a person, right? But we can certainly imagine that if there were people who left Egypt, someone may have been their leader, may have spearheaded such an escape. I will say that for me, the thing that, if not convinces, at least leans me toward the possibility that there may be some kernel of truth behind the existence of a Moses is his name. There's something funny about the name Moses. Despite the Bible's attempt to tell us otherwise, the Bible gives us a very obviously false etymology of Moses' name. Despite that not particularly convincing attempt to give Moses' name a Hebrew origin, the name Moses is, of course, pure Egyptian. We know what it means. It means son. And it's, in fact, a standard part of some well-known Egyptian names that you're probably familiar with. The Pharaoh Tutmosis. There's the Moses part, right? That name means son of the god Thoth. Even more famously, Ramesses. That Messes part is the same word as Moses, and Ramesses means son of the god Ra. So the Bible goes to like some lengths in telling the Moses story to make sure that we know that Moses was definitely Israelite despite his name. We know about his parents. We know about the fact that despite having an Egyptian name despite having been raised in an Egyptian palace, right, he definitely wasn't Egyptian. All of which, I will admit, suggests to me, at least, that there is some sort of distant reality that they're accounting for. At least they recognize that it's weird that the hero of the Israelite Israelite history or Israelite story should be a guy with a distinctively Egyptian name. Again, that is not at all to affirm the historicity of the biblical account of Moses. But there may well have been someone with that name involved somehow. All that having been said, we're not really here to discuss the historicity of Exodus. We're here in these sessions to talk about a book, which is to say, a story, a narrative. Whether it really happened or not, I'm going to suggest, is not particularly relevant. I will tell a brief story here. A number of years ago, when I was in graduate school, potentially a couple of years after, I got a phone call from my uncle, who had heard someone on the radio say that the Exodus never happened. And he called me and said he wanted to know if I, biblical scholar of the family, agreed that the Exodus never happened. And I said, yes, I agree. And he said, so what the hell am I doing every year at Passover? I pointed out to him, and I'll point out the same way here too. What we do with the Exodus story, whether as Jews at Passover or not, what we do with it doesn't require it to have actually happened. The Bible and tradition tells us that every year we should tell the story of the Exodus to our children. It doesn't say that every year we should discuss the archaeological evidence for the Exodus's historicity. It's the story that forms the basis of our faiths and traditions. So that's what we're interested in here. A story, a work of literature. This story is how ancient Israel understood itself, and that's what we want to understand. Okay. The final point, and a rather big one, and one that I warn you now, for those not familiar with what I do, one that will pervade everything else I say in the next 6 weeks. And that question is actually also tied to the dispute over whether the Exodus story is true or not. Here's the point. Exodus, like the rest of the Pentateuch, is not, in fact, just one story. Exodus is, in fact, 3 stories that have been interwoven, sometimes confusingly, into a single continuous narrative. And these stories come from 3 previously independent literary sources. So there were 3 Exodus stories, and they've been combined, right, interwoven like this, into one single Exodus story. These 3 literary sources in the book of Exodus we call P, J, we call them by letters. It's easier that way, though also confusing. We call them P, J, and E. I give them to you here in order of their appearance in Exodus. Each one of these stories, P, J, and E, each one of these sources has its own distinct understanding of what happened. They each tell this story in a unique way, not just in terms of their style, not just in terms of their theologies, though those too, but literally in terms of what happened, when, where, who, to whom, why and how. I think I got all the questions there. So each of these sources has its own version of the Exodus story. And when we ask, therefore, about the truth of the story of the Exodus, we kind of are stuck. Which one of those stories are we asking to be the true one? Why would we choose one over another? They can't all be true, since they conflict with each other regularly. But they are all biblical. Now, I cannot do a full rendering of this sort of notion of the text in our limited time and space together. But as we go along in the next few weeks, I will point out some of these contradictions and repetitions so that you can understand as we read why this text looks the way that it does, and so that we can observe the various ways that ancient Israelite authors imagined the past and imagined Israel's relationship with its deity, which is what the story is really about. I will, having said that I'm not going to do this at great length, I will, however, take a bit of time here to point out how this plays out just at the very beginning of the book, just so you have a sense of what we're up to. So here's the narrative conundrum that we face as we turn to the very first chapter of Exodus. We know that back in Genesis, God promised repeatedly, and in all of the literary sources of the text, promised that Israel would eventually become very numerous. Right? This is the promise to the patriarchs: I will make you a great nation, and I will make your offspring like the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. Right? That promise is given multiple times. And the question we want to ask is, okay, when did the people in fact become very numerous? When did they go from family to nation? Which is really what that promise is about. When did it happen? Under what circumstances did it happen? And how does it relate to the Egyptian oppression of Israel here in the first chapter of Exodus? Now, the attentive reader may note that Exodus 1 contains 3 separate statements about Israel multiplying. Here they are. Exodus 1:7, the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. Exodus 1:12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And 1:20, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. Each of these statements occurs in a distinctive way, a distinctive setting. The first one of them, Exodus 1:7, despite most English translations, is actually in the Hebrew in the pluperfect. Not the Israelites became fruitful, but the Israelites had become fruitful. They had multiplied and grown strong. In other words, this verse isn't telling us something new. It's reminding us of something that has already happened. And for one of our sources in the Pentateuch, that's true. According to P, this happened back in Genesis 47:27. Israel settled in the land of Egypt, and they gained possessions and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. So for this author, Israel's multiplying, again, going from family to nation, precedes the beginning even of the book of Exodus, precedes Israel's being enslaved. In fact, is the reason that the Egyptians impose slavery on Israel, right? They have already become too big. That's one perspective. Multiplying first, then enslavement as a result. The second of these versions, Exodus 1:12, has the Israelites multiplying not before being enslaved, but actually, weirdly, as a result of being enslaved. Pharaoh, in this story, is worried that Israel will, in fact, become too numerous, right? Let's deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase. They haven't yet, right? But Pharaoh is sort of like anticipates the danger of this large population. So Pharaoh enslaves them in order to prevent that from happening. But as the story tells us, it backfires. This is Jay's version of the story. And Jay's version of the story actually begins with a callback to Jay's story in Exodus. A new king arose over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. Right? It's in Jay that Joseph does all the great work for Pharaoh and is, honored for it. The idea of a new king forgetting Joseph's service is part of that story. So again, in P, we have the Israelites multiplying all the way back in Genesis and them being enslaved as a result. In J, we have Israelites being enslaved in order to prevent them from multiplying and becoming a great nation, but they do it anyway. Right? It's sort of a, not comeuppance for Pharaoh, but a reversal of his desires. And the third version of this, in 120, is part of kind of a sort of entirely different little episode, which is the story of the midwives who saved the Israelite newborn males from being killed due to Pharaoh's decree. Now, even in a very broad way, the story of Pharaoh deciding to kill all of the Israelite newborn males never really made sense as part of a story about Pharaoh enslaving the Israelites in order to get labor out of them. If Pharaoh wants to enslave Israel and have them do work for him, then killing them off, which of course is what happens after one generation of killing all of the newborn males, killing off Israel seems dumb. So here in this account of the multiplying, which is from our E source, the oppression that Israel experiences in Egypt isn't slavery at all. It's genocide. And it's in the face of this genocide that Pharaoh is imposing on Israel. It's in the face of that genocide that Israel multiplies, right? Thanks to the midwives who, push back against Pharaoh's plans. Now, it is admittedly a little weird to imagine an Exodus story that didn't have slavery in it. But I'm here to tell you that that's just what E has. That's just how E tells the story, both here in Exodus 1 and in fact throughout. And just to jump ahead for a second as my little bit of extra evidence for this, we will in a few weeks eventually come to the law code in the book of Exodus in chapters 21 through 23, which we call the covenant code, which is also from E. And there in that law code, regular reference will be made to Israel's experience in Egypt, as in fact happens in most of the law codes, right? Where we might expect statements like, do X or Y, or, treat people well because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, which is exactly what we have, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy. Right? We have a explicit reference to Israel having been slaves, and therefore they have to take care of the vulnerable in their society. The parallel lines in E's version, in the covenant code, say, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It simply never says you were slaves. It's you were strangers. You're not allowed to oppress a stranger because you know the heart of a stranger. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. It's interesting that, again, here, it doesn't say slave, it says stranger, and nor does it say don't enslave a stranger. It says don't oppress, which is a relatively broad term that I think probably could cover genocide. So we're reckoning then, and I don't think we're going to come back to this again probably in the conversation, but it's nice to have it out there. one of the sources of the Pentateuch, E, simply doesn't think that Israel was enslaved in Egypt, which, is kind of crazy, right? Okay, so one of the tasks that lies ahead of us in our time here is to recognize that our Exodus story, the one that we sort of know and, Jews tell every year at Passover, and that gets, told again and again in movies and in books and in all kinds of cultural media. That Exodus story is, in fact, 3 Exodus stories, and they don't all agree with one another. And that's not just sort of a modern academic perspective or thing to say. It's actually an inherent part of the biblical text. Right? The biblical text that we have our sort of canonical Exodus story, couldn't and wouldn't exist if there weren't these 3 constituent parts making it up. So Exodus, like the rest of the Pentateuch, is a record of ancient Israel's disparate views on its own past. And that disparity, I'm suggesting, actually is what makes the text what it is. Not a single one of the sources of Exodus, not P, not J, and not E, tells the story as we're familiar with it. And this is a point I will come back to a couple of times more in our time together, as I point out places where, where as we unravel the threads, we discover stories that, look like but aren't quite, or we reveal things about perspectives, like here in where E doesn't think that there's slavery. You would never know that. You would never know that someone in ancient Israel thought that Israel wasn't enslaved in Egypt unless we did this kind of analysis and work. None of these sources, again, tells the story that we're familiar with, but the story we're familiar with is an amalgam of all of them. But each of them, I'm going to suggest, represents a perspective on this story that is worth understanding, and again, that contributes to the whole. So again, while I'm not going to do this kind of pulling the text apart every single week, though I think I am going to do it next week, though I'm not going to do it every single week, I am going to make regular reference as we go along to the sources, and I'm going to note how they're distinctive from one another. And if this is the kind of thing you want to know more about, here is some shameless self-promotion. Okay. I wanted to keep this first session on the shorter side because, there's a lot to take in. And, I wanted to leave time for some broader questions before we get into sort of the more detailed stuff coming up. But I want to say now at the end of the session that Exodus is in fact one of the longer books of the Hebrew Bible, and is far too big to cover comprehensively. So we are going to have to skip some parts, and you may be annoyed at me if I skip the part that you are most excited about. And I apologize in advance. I can certainly try to fill in some gaps in question time if need be. But I will say now that next time we are going to jump ahead a few chapters and get right into the plagues and the crossing of the sea. So chapters 7 through 15 of Exodus. So if you've got questions, I may address a couple of things that come in between Exodus 1 and Exodus 7 before I jump in next time. But again, I can't do it all. Many apologies for that. Having said all that, I am happy to have some conversation in discussion with your various questions. Let me stop screen sharing. Okay. Let's see what we got here in the questions. This is the most fun part of the thing. Okay. Let's get back to where we were. William, whose name I recognize from Twitter, said, this is a brief thing, said, I recently heard about a source called H. I just talked about P and J and E, but I've heard about an H. What is that? And I'm not going to get deep into the weeds on this kind of thing. H is a letter that we use to designate a later layer of the P document. So it is there's a broader P text. P stands for priestly, and H is a later layer thereof. I don't think it's going to matter one way or another to us in this time here. I refer to the documentary hypothesis. It was on the title of my book. I didn't refer to it in my speaking, but that is what we're talking about when I say P, J, and E. These are the documents of the documentary hypothesis, which again is sort of the theory of how it is that the Pentateuch came to be, the interweaving of strands. At one point, the theory was challenged. We know I've written a book called Renewing the Documentary Hypothesis. Can I explain the essence of how the theory was revived? Yes, I wrote a book. Is how the theory was revived. I don't know that I have. I will point to the book. I mean, the short answer is many theories, especially in the humanities, go through sort of waves of acceptance and rejection, and that entails often a theory becoming, I don't know, too top heavy or too big for its own britches. You know, a theory that gets so convoluted as people sort of dig into details and try and figure out that it becomes less and less tenable. So when I talk about there being these multiple sources, I'm trying to do it in really sort of a very simple, straightforward way, recognizing that the picture was undoubtedly more complicated. But the documentary hypothesis and the existence of multiple sources, in the end, seems to me like the most economical and coherent explanation for the literary phenomena that we see in the Pentateuch. And again, over our time together, we'll come across a couple of other spaces in the text where I think the existence of sources will sort of justify itself pretty well. I could probably go through most of these that I see. This is a funny one. I recently heard an Egyptian tour guide vehemently deny that Jews were ever enslaved in Egypt, but lost track of his involved explanation of that denial. Am I familiar with Egyptian belief or history on this topic? Is it possible that the E-source could be the basis? It is not possible that the E-source could be the basis, because I don't think anybody knew the E-source existed between the time of it having been combined with the other sources into our Bible and, I don't know, me telling you just now that it exists. That's not true. It was discovered a couple hundred years ago, but still, I would say the claim that Jews were never enslaved in Egypt, I'm going to say is true, but I'm going to say it's true because I want to make a consistent distinction between Jews and ancient Israelites. And in fact, I'm not convinced, based on what I said earlier about historicity, that ancient Israelites, self-identified as such, were really enslaved in that sense either. Again, peoples who were of a Semitic origin, who may have originally at some point been, native to Canaan, probably were enslaved in Egypt at a certain point. In what numbers, we don't know. But if I'm going to tell you that the Exodus story as we have it in the Bible didn't happen, then I guess I'm agreeing with the Egyptian tour guide that, certainly I would say Jews were never enslaved in Egypt, but it's a more complicated answer, I think, than probably what was going for there. What do I think of the idea that Moses was partially adapted from the story of Hammurabi? Specifically the part where Hammurabi received his divine law code from the sun god Shamash? I love that question, in part because it reminds us that the biblical story of the Exodus did not emerge from some sort of vacuum, nor did it emerge directly from independently from the existence of its Israelite authors or culture. Ancient Israel lived very much among the peoples of its surroundings of the ancient Near East. So the notion of gods giving laws to humans to leaders is widespread, and Hammurabi is an example of it. It's not the same as saying, I think, that the Moses story is, adapted from Hammurabi, just that everyone in the ancient Near East was sharing some sort of common cultural milieu in which laws, were often given by deities to rulers. But that's not the only place we see this. I'm not going to talk about it anyplace else, so I'll talk about it right now. But the Moses birth story, where he's sort of put in a basket and sent down a river and rescued and raised somewhere else. That story is, 2,000 years older than our biblical text, and comes from also from Mesopotamia, from Babylonia, and is what's called the birth legend of Sargon. It's like a 3rd millennium BCE legend about the great founding monarch of the Babylonian Empire, Sargon. And it's the same story, except instead of being found by an Egyptian princess, he's found by a goddess. But otherwise, it's effectively exactly the same thing. In this case, I think it's probably safe to say that the people who created the Moses story were, in fact, pulling from a known Mesopotamian tradition, and creating their sort of version. Well, if this is how great people are identified, right? Here's how they marked Sargon's high status, unique status among all people. We got that too, right? And here's our version of it. So there's plenty of it. There's plenty of material. When we get to the Covenant Code, we're going to see how that is in part responding to and dependent probably on Hammurabi and laws like it. There's all kinds of stuff in our Exodus story that, again, is clearly drawing on traditions and cultural artifacts and cultural elements of the broader ancient Near East. That shouldn't be surprising. The entire Bible is that way. But again, it gets back to the question of, ask things about historicity. Well, when we see a story that is, clearly drawing on influences, history and historicity really, again, become something of a genre error. Hundreds of years pass from the death of Joseph to the beginning of Exodus. Do I think there is a missing book? Wouldn't that be something? We're, as biblical scholars, we're always on the lookout for what's the next Dead Sea Scroll thing? What's the next thing that's going to upend everything we know about everything? That would really be one of them. I don't think so. And I don't think so, in part because it's not exactly the case that there's a big gap between the beginning of one and the next. In all of our sources, whatever time is in between the death of Joseph and the beginning of Exodus is marked either by a period of enslavement or by a reckoning of generations. At the end of the book of Exodus has a reckoning of multiple generations that pass. But my sort of sneaky real answer to this is, it's not, in fact, clear in a universal sense that all of the biblical sources, our Pentateuchal sources, P, J, and E, it's not clear that they all thought that hundreds of years passed between the death of Joseph and the beginning of Exodus. In fact, I would suggest that the story that says, now a new king arose who didn't remember Joseph, takes place right after the death of Joseph. So again, it's one of the most common things that we do as readers, especially those of us who are familiar with these stories as they have been presented to us culturally in movies and books, etc., or in church and synagogue retellings. One of the things that we often do is simply assume that any version of the story is going to have certain things in common. 400 years of slavery. I'm here to tell you only P thinks there's 400 years of slavery. Everyone would have had slavery. E doesn't think there was slavery. We're going to run into Miriam eventually. Only E ever heard of Miriam, right? So that, there's all these kinds of things that are elements that are unique to one story or another. All together, they form our canonical tale that we know and love. But we shouldn't expect them all to agree on some of these things. Okay. how did the authors or audience decide what new or existing versions of a narrative was legitimate? What did that even mean for them? And that's a fascinating question, because the question itself assumes that these stories would have needed to have a kind of authority or legitimacy. And I guess, I'm here to say at the beginning of our time studying the Bible together, I'm here to say that we're the ones who legitimated and authenticated, not sure that's the word I'm looking for, the Bible as Bible. To put it another way, when P and J and E were writing their versions of the Exodus story, they weren't like, I'm going to write the Bible now, right? Like they were writing a story, they were writing a text, and there's no reason to think that they certainly would have anticipated us reading it now. They certainly wouldn't have anticipated it being combined with other stories into our canonical text. And from what I can tell, for the most part, until they were combined together into our sort of canonical Pentateuch, I don't think that too many people outside of their own little scholarly scribal communities cared much about them either. So, how do you decide which version is legitimate? It's the version right? The people who told the E version of the story, that was their version of the story. I often use as an analogy, I'm not sure if it's perfectly appropriate in this moment, but the analogy I often use in terms of these competing versions of the Exodus story, for example, is if you were to ask somebody here in Connecticut, where I am, to tell you the story of the Civil War, right? The American Civil War, what went on there, and you ask for the same question of somebody in Alabama, you would get a very a sort of framework of events, but lots of things would be different. Which version of the story is a legitimate one? It depends where you are and who you're asking. And I think that's kind of what we have going on here. Let's see what else I've got. Oh man, there's more people with questions than I thought. You guys all jumped in at the end. That's not fair. Why do you, some of these are repeated. That's nice. Why do E and J sound similar and are hard to distinguish clearly by scholars? I don't know that they sound as similar as has often been said. This is a little bit insider baseball-y, so I'm going to answer it briefly. I think they're less similar than people think, but I think it's less that E and J sound very much alike and more that P sounds like no one else. I think that's a better way of putting that. No, I'm not going to answer that one. That's somebody asking me to write a thing, and the answer is no. When I said that Exodus is a fifth of the Pentateuch, the question is, shouldn't it be a fourth of the Pentateuch with D, the fourth source, Deuteronomy, being separate? And the answer is no. Nope, the Pentateuch as a whole is Genesis through Deuteronomy, and that was the work. And Deuteronomy is as equally tucked in with its D source as our J, E, and P sources are here in Exodus. It's just that it doesn't start until later. Oh man. I've got a couple. Okay, I've gotten to the bottom, so maybe I'll work my way back up and see where we were. Okay. Were the people who wrote P, J, and E aware of each other, and did they debate with each other? If they had Twitter, the answer is almost certainly yes, but they didn't. This is a question. It's a fascinating question because it's one for which we can only have a certain amount of evidence, which is to say, it is absolutely possible that the people, or the schools at least, responsible for P, J, and E knew about each other, read each other's texts, not not you're right, they're books, not their tweets. Read each other's literature, knew about each other, and were in constant dialogue with each other. That is possible. It is, however, not at all evident in the text, which is to say, there is nothing when you read P that suggests that they are trying to have an argument with one of the other sources. They're simply telling the story as they tell it, and so too for the others. Is it possible that there was some sort of implicit rejection of other sources? Maybe. I know from certain other biblical texts what it looks like when one text is openly rejecting and responding to another one, and we simply don't have that for J, E, and P with the relation to each other. And so, to follow up the next question that was asked, somebody said, what's the sequence then of these three, right? Which one was first? And so if we know who's first, then I'll know who's responding to whom. And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know who's first. I think we want to keep in mind, none of these should we think about, and I'll make this the end, recognizing there are lots of questions and lots of people want to know lots of things about this particular, the compositional history stuff. I do too. It's like my favorite topic, but I can't do it all day long. I mean, I can, but I'm not going to. We often think, okay, there was one source and then someone wrote the next one responding to, and someone wrote the next one responding to, and then someone put them together. But there is, in fact, actually there's no evidence for that being the case, with at least with these three, with P, J, and E. I don't know when they were all written, in part because in no point here are we talking about like one person who sat down and wrote the whole thing, and then they like finished, they were like, I hit publish and it's done. Right? That's not how ancient literature was produced or received. In all of our sources, in fact, I would say every single book of the Bible, I think that's safe to say, we have evidence for extensive revision of text over time. It could be over little time, it could be multiple revisions over lots of time, but we're not talking about a text being associated with one sort of solitary genius sitting in his office at Yale writing this thing. We're talking about texts that were created and received and edited and expanded and revised by sort of schools of scribes and thinkers over centuries, probably. So once you say that, what does first and second and third mean, right? I think they were probably all being continuously worked on simultaneously. And again, when I don't see any literary evidence for one responding to another, nor do I think that there's anything in them that is particularly clear about dating, certainly not even not relative dating, but not objective dating either. I think it becomes very difficult to talk about putting them in order, and I think we can sort of let go of the notion that responding to each other. And I like that better, right? When we think about these authors, rather than thinking about, well, somebody wrote the story and then somebody, came back with a different version of it. What we're seeing here is, in fact, the existence of multiple ideas about Israel's past that were being, sort of generated and recognized and produced and disseminated and discussed all at the same time, right? Which is to say, it was a real live legitimate society where different people think different things, especially people who live in different areas, or people who come from different backgrounds or have different cultural status, right? The story that the farmer in the hill country tells about Israel's origins is probably not going to be identical to the story that the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem tells. It'd be kind of weird if that were the case. That's not how any other culture has ever worked. So the nice thing about seeing this sort of stuff in Exodus and in the Pentateuch generally is we get all of it, right? We don't just get one elitist take. they're all elitist takes, but we don't just get one of them, right? We get multiple takes on the same material, and that sort of expands our understanding of ancient Israel and how they thought about things, and expands our understanding of the text too. And now that Kelly has shown up on my screen, it must be time for me to stop talking. Again, thank you all for joining me in this first session. Again, the plague story through the departure and the Song of the Sea in chapter 15. I'm going to try and hustle through all that material next time. Give it a quick look. Go check out the Yale Bible Study videos if you like, conversations between me and John Collins on those topics, or just come hang out with us next time. We look forward to seeing you.